Hello? Are we on? Perfect. Good evening, everybody. Welcome. I'm very happy to be here with you tonight and in this fantastic city and amazing school. First of all, I want to express my highest gratitude to Strelka Institute and Triumph Gallery that invited me for this occasion in coordinates with a fantastic exhibition which is going to be open tomorrow, actually. A group of amazing young Iranian artists going to open up, going to show their works in the Triumph Gallery, and it's going to be open around 7, so don't miss it. What we're going to talk about today probably can give you a background or side information about what you're going to see tomorrow. So please put this next to each other because the visual work come in actual scale tomorrow at the gallery. My presentation today is going to be partly referring to a research which I have been developing during the last couple of years, which if I want to briefly explain it or frame it, it's going to be about the politics and space, or the politics of space in the city of Tehran. A city that I grew up in and has been inspiring me for all my works, architectural work, artistic production, writings, and even teachings. By the way, I am Hamed, as Gala just introduced me, Hamed Khosravi. I'm an architect and educated as an architect. As I told you, I'm originally from Tehran, but currently I work between Iran, Netherlands, and UK, where I teach in different universities, and I worked with two colleagues of mine, Amir Jalali and Francesco Marulo, with whom I co-founded a curatorial framework and a collective research collective which is called Behemoth Press. So here we are. What are we talking about when we talk about Tehran? I'm sure you all heard about this city and you know all about it, but to me, the most interesting part as an architect, as an Iranian architect about this city is that actually comparing to average Iranian cities, Tehran is relatively a young one. Its history doesn't go further than 13th century. It used to be a very small village in the north side of actually a prominent city which is called Ray. This is Ray and this is Tehran. And Tehran was fortunate enough, which after Mongols' invasion in Iran in early 13th century, that they destroyed the city of Ray, and all the inhabitants of Ray moved to Tehran, and slightly it became a city. But again, it was one of the most luckiest places on earth, because in 1794, this king chose this city, this rather unknown city, as a capital of Iran, the Persian Empire, as you might know. And suddenly, less than 100 years after, the city was growing fast. And today, we are facing this scale of a city. A city of 16 million inhabitants in day, actually in night, and 20 million inhabitants during the day, something comparable to Moscow probably, which actually is a spread in a quite low density in a wide field between the mountain and the central desert of Iran. The mountain is the distinguished part of the city, if pollution lets you see the space. But the fact is, Tehran is not well known for its charm, or for its architecture, or for its infrastructure, its beautiful river that he never has, or its monuments. I think you're going to agree with me that Tehran is mostly known by its politicians, by these figures that represent the city and the country throughout its slightly more than 200 years old of its time. People that not only narrate the city, but also represent the city internationally in the widest range possible. So Tehran is always linked with the figures, with the politics. And that's why perhaps no architectural or urban description of the city can be separated from its politics. it is in fact intertwined and interlinked layers that we cannot distinguish. And it's one of the most, let's say, unique cities that I would say that the architecture and the urban form of the city shapes the politics, and the politics is getting inspired by the shape of the space or by the way that the space is formed. In a way, architecture and built environment plays very active role in the shaping of the city. A very famous photo of 1979 revolution. We are talking about a city of conflicted history and contested spaces. Let's go a little bit back, June 2009. After doubtful re-election of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad as the 10th president of Iran, a wave of mass demonstration took over the streets of Tehran. I'm sure that you've heard about the incidents, giving shape to the widest representation of public demonstration after Islamic Revolution of 1979. But this protest did not end, or did not really was not limited in the public spaces or the squares or the streets of the city. It actually moved the supporters of the Mir Hossein Mousavi, the other candidate, the oppositional candidate, brought the demonstration into the private spaces. The protest, the resistance from the streets slightly moved inside the houses, inside the typical houses. Even the armed police entered the usual apartments of Tehran. People went upstairs to the rooftops or balconies chanting Allahu Akbar, or resistance, let's say, demonstration, resonating a powerful sense of solidarity and communion, transcending beyond the four walls of the private spaces. This is a famous photo of the WordPress photo, winner of the WordPress photo in 2009, showing the girl on the rooftop of her house, protesting and chanting Allahu Akbar. While these public demonstrations are not common in Iran, they always mark an exceptional reality, exceptional moment in the political history of the country. The rooftop callings, echoing during the summer of 2009, however, gave a powerful sensory experience of the invisible. We cannot call it public and not yet private. I would say it's something merged between the public sphere of the city and the private sphere. It demonstrates only one example of this action, which is extended and expanded from the public space and emerges and flourishes within the four walls of the private spaces of the house. In a way, people shape their own elevated public spaces, which is not controlled anymore by the state, but by the collective body of the inhabitants. This collective resistance that periodically happens in Iran, actually, having said that, because the cities and the public space is widely controlled, it's a miraculous happening, because Tehran's public space are surveillanced and policed by the government. It's not the case of Islamic Republic. It was the case before as well, during the Shah and the Pahlavi regimes. So morals and dress codes are enforced by police, and the state agents and even civil servants are chosen based on their compliance to the specific ideology of the state. In this way, public sphere of the city is perceived by many as unsafe and unprotected, a concept which is not really usual in the Western mind, because the public space used to be the safe ground because the state is responsible to protect it. So consequently, most of the activities that are supposedly public are pushed into the interiors, are pushed into the houses, voluntarily somehow. This does not mean that the state and police, let's say, dominance uh, is not really, let's say, pushing the citizens, but the political community is rather choose to brew inside the private spaces, within the four walls, as I would call it, away from the eyes of the moral police and the iconography and monumentality and the public ritual of the political life. It happens, then it proliferates in the interiors, where the codes are lifted and life is protected. Beyond the space of dwelling, the house becomes actually the space of public disobedience, where you can drink, where you can take out your veil, when you can protest, when you can chant. The act that we know mostly is going to happen and used to happen in the public demonstration, public spaces of the city. Not only that, but for any autonomous initiative that escaped a merely private dimension, let's say art galleries, reading groups, publishing houses, dancing clubs, galleries, startups, all these things you can find it inside houses. Gathering their own small collective, friends, through the online social media or through the proximity or the circle of friends, and creating an underground cycle of economy, production, cultural production, and intellectual production. Such a specific collective dimension proper to Tehran, it's more than private, not yet public. Perhaps we could call it collective or common spaces. It redefines the traditional category of a space, which I'm sure you know it and you're familiar with, which famously Hannah Arendt explained them as work, labor, and action. Just to briefly describe this, Arendt famously categorized these three layers and defined labor as, actually defined work as the activity directed to production of objects and tools. However, labor is merely reproductive effort spent in keeping ourselves alive and is not proper to human life because it's only conditioned by the necessities. But however, Arendt saw the quintessential manifestation of human freedom into action, political action, an action without end or with no object, manifested through the linguistic ability of individuals. While traditionally work and labor manifest themselves in the private spaces of the house, action constitutes a political sphere as well as public spaces. Rather than blurring between these categories that Arendt suggested us or categorized for us, it seems that the houses in Tehran is not only being politicized, but also try to accommodate part of the public activities, part of the action, which is supposedly happens in the public spheres. In other words, freedom, human freedom, is better expressed in the private spaces. Although it could be said that this demise of public space and privatization of society and interiorization of political life are common these days in all the societies, but Tehran perhaps shows this process in a radical manner. At the same time, a highly idiosyncratic fashion. It is in fact not only because of the political spheres or the political condition or the contemporary condition of Tehran, but I would argue that's something deeply cultural, historical, and even related to the environmental and the territory that we live in. Just to unfold this paradigmatic case of Tehran, I would like to argue that we are going to see something more than a contemporary phenomenon. We are talking about a concept of Iranian architecture, the way it's shaped and the way it's developed in relation to territory and the power. That's DNA, that's the origin of the, let's say, the architecture and the space of the city, which has been also reflected or has been reacted and enabled in the contemporary condition of the city. Before going through the architectural origin of the city, I would just to remind that we are talking about a territory which, as you know, the original form of life there has been always nomadism. We are talking about a landscape stretched between Indian Peninsula to North Africa, where the life of the nomads and daily activities of a nomad were in fact act of survivals. Any form of life is an ideal life. If you can stay alive, you're living an ideal life, because the distinction between life and death is binary. Each aspect of life, therefore, is a right, protected and supported by a god or a spirit, and a house is actually manifestation of these rituals, where those rights protecting and regulating every life's form and habits. Architecture of these houses, therefore, I would call it, is their main task is to protect and to let life proliferate and flourishes beyond this limit. That perhaps is famously described by a very good contemporary architect and theorist, Bernard Koch, which relates it to the essential essence of architecture today. He calls it that the idea of architecture actually resides in the act of delimiting an interval of space and time in order to allow life to grow, but also to relate it to an environment, to an external environment and the territory. To me, that would be a best introduction to what we're going to see. The origin of architecture in Iranian landscape is actually very simple. It's a very spatial diagram, if you like. And paradoxically, it's called paradise. If paradise in other culture corresponds to the ideal or even imaginary form of living, in Iranian territory, it identifies the only way that you can live in that territory. What is paradise? The word, as you know, is Persian. It's from the root paridaiza, which literally means walled space. It insists on the idea of the wall as a divider, when it defines what does or does not relates to the protected space. The wall here is not defensive at all, because the second part of the word daeza means to be out of clay, to be constructed out of earth. So it indicates the fragility of the wall, which is not defensive at all. It's just demarcating the territory. The idea of paradise does not only exist as a concept, as I just said, but it serves as the only model or as the only prototype that the city and architecture historically has been developing in this territory, or this country, if you like. It's been reduced down to spatial organization. This could be simply seen in this beautiful etching by Kircher, that we can identify this element, these simple elements of paradise. A wall, rather low, earthen wall, two streams of water which crossing each other at the middle of the walled state, tree of life, and four guardians which protecting and serving the theological protection over the city. This rather abstract composition, I would say, illustrates the essence of architecture that all we talk about. Perhaps one of the most famous manifestations of the concept of paradise is known as Persian Garden. With no original association with leisure or agriculture, as we all famously know, Persian gardens were the only special configuration where any form of life can happen. They were, in fact, life-sustaining camps in the literal tabula rasa of Persian territory. They were always behind a wall, outside of which are death and decadence, and inside is the only way that you can live, under the shadow or with the stream of water. The common layout of a garden is simply described as chaharbagh, which is a cruciform shape, two streams of water crossing each other in the middle of a squared walled space, and divide the space into 4 equal sections. There is no association with any plants, any flowers, any flavor, or any scent in garden. Garden is about distribution of life, which is represented by water in a land, and make it inhabitable, as is clearly shown in this image. Not only that, but it shows that these gardens are the end point of a large-scale engineering and territorial organization that brings water from the kilometers away, from the foot of mountain to that specific places. This technology, this historic technology is called as qanat, is known as qanat, which is actually a subterranean aqueduct. It's a section that brings the water from the springs or the foot of mountains to a place which is able to inhabit people. So we have to imagine that the construction of this rather large infrastructure happens prior to any settlements, because first you need to have water and a distribution system, then you will be able to live there. So these gardens were actually outposts of these underground networks. And in the scale, we are talking about a territorial scales, hundreds of kilometers, punctuated lands with this series of wells, which brings water to specific places. The form of gardens in this sense are related intimately with their functions. So they are calculated gridded spaces that shows how much water we could extract from the city, how much land we can give water to, and how many people we can actually place on this territory. It's a protocol, if you like. It's a protocol of settlement. But something happens historically which is very interesting. The architecture is actually being developed by thickening this wall, this earthen wall, and makes it inhabitable. We are talking about the same garden which historically being thickened, the wall, and life is being accommodated within the walls of this garden. What, to me, could be read as an interesting and paradigmatic phenomena here is that we are talking about a tension between a harsh landscape and a place that we can live in. And lives of the people, houses of the people, the domestic spaces are not inside, are the wall, are beholders of these tensions. They are placed, the life is separating, the life is guarding the interior, which is mostly conceived as sacred, and the outside, which is the wild, unknown, or rather hostile environment. In this way, we could say that these inhabitable frames are the indexes of the Iranian city or Iranian architecture. The construction of these urban artifacts requires a precise knowledge of territory, land territorial survey, geological, let's say, engineering, and also mechanical engineering and hydraulic engineering. Therefore, these spaces cannot be constructed without an executive power, a large-scale executive power. That's why architecture is essentially a royal phenomenon, is a state-oriented apparatus in this territory. The only way that you can live is through a power which is practiced and exercised in the large territory. So in this reading, architecture plays a dialectical relationship between power and life of the nomads, which we can describe them as movement. You know that states represent static or stabilizing forces, and it's in contrast with nomads. And conflicts plays a mediator between this dialectical relationship, between the state and movement, and or power and resistance. We could say that, or we could rephrase that in this way, architecture as a state apparatus gives protection and momentary stabilization to the subjects. At the same time, this momentary protection allow those subjects to organize a collective body and being able to break through the walls or go beyond. First, you're going to be secure that you're safe, and then you'll be able to make riots, to resist, and to break the walls and go beyond it, as it was well presented in this famous photo, which I love it. They are to tame and to protect. Let's go back to our beloved city, Tehran. You know that cities are being introduced to the world through two things. Either they're maps or descriptions. And the first description of Tehran happens in 13th century in a book by Yaqut, the Arab geographer, which has a very simple, a rather brief description of the city. I would just read through the sentence. He writes that Tehran is shaped out of grid of interwoven garden. By that, he simply concludes, this unique feature has made the city a secured place for its inhabitants. After 9 centuries, the city still manifests the same characteristics. Overlays of grids of water, infrastructure, gardens, plots of land, and even, let's say, subterranean infrastructure, which are kind of formed by interlocking walls of individual cells. And overruling security and control have eroded public domain of the city in favor of the overprotected cells, overprotected domestic spaces. The architecture of the city, in fact, thus, has become reduced to a simple diagram, inhabitable walls, wherein space has become abstract notion, whose primary task is neither to fulfill any desire, nor to follow any function. It is to separate and to protect life, celebrating a dichotomy between interior and exterior, norm and exception, and inclusion and exclusion. Here I would like to briefly address this assumption of what we just talked about and applying them into few exercises that I did with my student a couple of years ago to see how architecture can be produced out of these concepts, at least as a hypothesis. So it was in 2012 which I ran a graduation studio in the Berlage Institute, which does not exist anymore, used to be in Rotterdam. And the founder of Berlage Institute actually are shared people with the founder of Strelka Institute. Dealing with the architecture of domestic space in Tehran and testing some of those ideas that we just went through in order to reveal the socio-political significance of the city and its domestic spaces. This project, I would just tell you some notes that how we should read those projects and how we should see it. This project were not meant to produce a new order for the city at all, or proposing any master plan, if you like. The result was a paradoxical collection of monuments for different social and political agents in the city, for a non-state organization of space. That's a paradoxical term, which we know that we cannot achieve it, but we try to test our hypothesis there. The status of this project is therefore contradictory. There are neither practical solution nor any utopian vision for the city or for its architecture. Instead, they stem from pushing some of the conditions that are found in the city to the extreme to raise awareness or to test few hypotheses. I would just briefly mention 3 projects very quickly because I know that I'm talking too long. A house for a middle-class family, a house for knowledge worker, and a house for an artist. This project, the first one, is the house for a middle-class family. The project is, in fact, poses a critique to the dissolution of the old garden of the city, which is in fact being represented today as urban villas, which is only a place for privileged and upper middle class. And they are spread in the north and west part of the city. So the student took actually a kind of methodological approach towards her design. While the gardens were the spaces for collective life, which any form of life you could find there, she tried to use the same idea and proposes a classless urban villa. So the project aims to reconstruct this idea of garden through the construct of a house for middle class. She took a typical plot of land in Tehran, the minimum size, which is 7 by 30 meter long, oriented north-south, and stretch in that direction. She divided the space into 3 7 by 7 spaces, each one housing a young couple with no children, opening up the course, which is in this section is, you can follow these 3 ones, opening up the course into a walled garden, which also works as patio in between, around which you can find a free space of living, which could be a bedroom, closet, a separate toilet and bathroom. But at the center, you have a common kitchen, which as Russian, you must be familiar with this type of architecture, which was very famous in Soviet architecture in early 20th century, a common kitchen for collective houses. Leonidov and Ginsburg architecture is the main feature. At the center of this space, which is the heart of this house, you can go down, which you have a field open just for the workshop, can be shared with any people and can be accessed from the street, and it could be acted as common spaces. Even can accommodate some activities which is not supposedly private activities, or can be common or can be public. She used the idea of architecture of garden as a spatial organization, not as a definite form. In a way, this is a prototype that can be expanded, can create a block, can create a city at the end, which was the goal of her projects. The second project looks into the knowledge worker as an archetypical subject currently in Tehran. It could be a student, professor, writer, journalist, whoever produces and works and deals with the production of knowledge, immaterial labor, if you like. If the first house was talking about a couple or a nuclear family, in this one, this student tried to talk about or tried to tackle the issue of individuals. The same plot was divided into 2 extreme spaces, spaces of radical cell, which you can only fit a bed, and a common space, which is an oval-shaped gathering space, which all the communal activities from eating, talking, watching TV, studying, or writing can happen. It's a Noah's Ark, perhaps, that students or knowledge workers can live in those little cells represented here, in these beds, and the rest could be communal activities. Of course, it's not a sustainable way of living. No, it's a prison. But he was very conscious about proposing this because he wanted to propose a clocking bomb in the center of Tehran that is for a student riot, because for him, what lacked in the student protests in Tehran back in 1999, it was lack of space, lack of a safe garden, lack of a safe space for a student to escape. So for him, this is double-sided proposal. It does not deal with the life or comfort in life. It's a clocking bomb, as I just said, to be exploded and to be expanded in the city. The last one, we are talking about the cultural production, artists. But a type of artists that are both escape the state control, at the same time market-oriented, let's say, art. They're trying to define themselves into voluntary self-exclusion in order to escape the censorship and to gain the maximum freedom. Of course, it's a suicide because it's exclusion of the society and the audience. Again, we are talking about the paradoxical condition here. So in this project, she dealt with the smallest scale found spaces in the city. And her, let's say, spatial intervention was just to connect them. Series of tunnels, staircases, doorways, elevators, and corridors connects the, let's say, unused and let's say, not that much useful or actually abandoned spaces of the city. It could be part of a parking or garage, or an unused swimming pool, or a water cistern, or part of the bunkers of Iran and Iraq war, which still exists in the city. So her project was to connect them and trying to make an autonomous network of spaces, which goes parallel and actually contradicts the logic of ownership which happens above them or parallel to them. So in the kind of one of the example in this plot, she just provided a doorway, separated doorway, to a pool, a swimming pool, and put a roof on top and make it a space. But as I just mentioned, her project was not to limit to the boundary of ownership because she was talking about different layers. These are partly undergrounds. So the aim was to go and create another city. Of course, nobody wants to live underground with no light and with no air conditioning. So she was wise enough to apply the project into part of a city which we have the dramatic topographic feature. When at one side you can get access to the streets and to light and having autonomous connection to the underground network, and on the other hand you can reach to the underground and unused spaces of the building. In this section, which is cut through the Valias Street, a rather central street of Tehran, with two hills backing them up, you can see that she got access to the underground networks, totally separated and autonomous spaces, legally and juridically, from the spaces on top. And at the same time, they are getting light, partly, and fresh air. So proposing, in a way, a self-refuge from the official state of cultural expression of the city into literally underground art condition and art exhibition. I'd like to end, perhaps here, it's rather long talk, by indicating that through this project we try to explore and make visible this political significance of a space which can be described merely as residential or domestic spaces. Not through the appropriation of organization of the public sphere, but in fact through the unfolding of potentials which you can find in the private one. In this way, private space is used to enable as a possibility of an active practice of involvement in the city, the active practice of citizenship, if you like. But like other membership, citizenship is defined and requires a form of commitment, a binding contract, if you like, that frames the subject and relate them to the performance of a law-giving power and the territory. Again, back to the original way of living in this territory. And architecture, for me, at least in this reading, or in Tehran, has the possibility to make this link happen. A very keen observation of this phenomena and the way that this political life are encaptured and enclosed within the domestic space of Tehran actually was observed during the the incidents of 1978 and 1979 by a person that we all know, Michel Foucault. He was famously fascinated by the Islamic nature and by the revolutionary nature of that riots and revolt, and which was kind of contradicting the usual, let's say, aspects known of the movement in the West. Foucault puzzled, in a way, the Western readers and praised Iranian Revolution despite of its religious, let's say, touch, which was not true because it was partly and mainly coordinated and empowered and engineered by the leftists as well. So what Foucault saw in the Iranian Revolution was less a project for a new form of a state, but was an ongoing and ever-present materialization of collective will, something that started perhaps centuries ago at the beginning of the foundation of the city, and is still there and manifests itself every now and then as an ongoing practice of resistance. Thank you.
Дорогие друзья, если у вас есть вопросы к нашему лектору, вы можете их задать. Пожалуйста.
So, Hamed, first of all, thank you very much for that lecture, and to Strelka and to Triumph Gallery, because it gave us, to all of us, like unique opportunity to receive the first information about the sophisticated and very much cultural country and the city of Tehran. I have two questions, but regarding architecture. So, does Tehran actually has a development plan? Because when you go there and you go to the north, like to Tahrir Square, you see absolutely all different buildings of all different styles. And you cannot understand, does it actually have a plan of the city or not? So, and actually, like in the center or in the south, it's not so many like new buildings. All of them are like generally old. And the second question, what's your favorite building like in Tehran? It's like
my favorite building.
Yeah, your favorite building. Okay. Yeah, Tabiat, another bridge, or Milad Tower, or something like that.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you. Actually, Tehran still has and have many master plans. The most famous one actually is done by famous Los Angeles-based architect Victor Gruen. That's why Tehran basically looked like Los Angeles in many senses, because infrastructure takes over the form, the public form, the urban form of the city. So, but the fact is, nothing has been realized fully. None of the master plan has been executed fully, because if we go through just the history of the city in the 20th century, almost every 10 years, we have a riot, a war, a demonstration, a revolution, something gonna happen. So this changing, this, let's say, revising the history, this revising the original and official documents and official body of the city has been resulted into unfinished plan. So Tehran, as the life of the city, is unfinished and ongoing. So it's been kind of developing with the life of the student, with the life of the citizen, and with the desire of them as well, in a kind of very subtle war between the legal body, the mayor and the municipality, and the architects or developers. That's why you can see different, although there are restricted, let's say, regulation and very down-to-earth measures that define the body of the city, like that plot of land which is highly, let's say, rationalized into 7 meter by 30 meter long, and you have to occupy 60% of the land. So there are measures which is really dominating the way that you're going to design the city, but also because it's an ongoing process of development and negotiation, there are always ways to escape it, to bend the rule, and to have a new exception. So that's why if you pay more in the north, you can build higher. If you don't have money, you stick to the plot of land in the south. So you have different sorts of, let's say, public or urban form in different patches of the city. And it's because of the territory that it kind of overlaps on, because we are talking about a highly topographic territory, valleys of rivers which are being occupied and being accommodated by the apartment building and residential building and architecture, And that's why, for example, those projects was able to be expressed in that way because the streets, the main streets of the city is actually forming or actually happening, going through a former river, and that's why you have a valley shape and you have this high topography around. So these are three layers, let's say legislative layers, topographic layers, and political layers of a city which overlaps and lively contradict with each other, that you come up with a living body which does not follow any direction but just expands vertically and horizontally. About my favorite building, it's very hard to say. There is a museum, it's called Museum of Contemporary Art in center of Tehran, which when I was young, I look at it as my second house. I was spending 12 hours, 13 hours, mostly per week there, walking on the moquettes and the carpets, sleeping on the couches, and going through the Andy Warhol pieces and Picasso's and Munch. And to me, that space still represents my favorite space of the city, but I have a personal attachment to the city, and I cannot judge it architecturally. I can judge it through my memories and the nostalgia that I have.
Hi, Hamed. My name is Anton. I'm teaching a course in Persian and Iranian literature and Iranian culture at a local university. So basically, thank you very much for coming here and for this wonderful lecture. My question concerns, not particularly it, but the architectural project that you are presenting tomorrow, the Project de Memorie at Medune Enkelab, the one that is your object at the exhibition. So I was wondering, you were talking constantly about the ongoing resistance and what the ongoing process that your work is on. Yeah. And the word ongoing was said several times with regard to Tehran. So I wonder, and I spoke to Humayun the other day, and he told me that the project that you're presenting at Medune Enkelab is the one that represents also an ongoing, sort of an epitome of an ongoing revolution as it is as it is depicted in the state propaganda in Iran. So I wonder whether it is the case, whether this ongoing revolution is some kind of mockery of the propaganda revolution, your project. And I wonder who are you aiming this project for? Is it for the students from Danishgah Tehran, or is it for just people who came up in the south of Tehran who are obviously not that better off as the person in the north? Why your project was particularly there, and what does it say?
May I ask,
thank you.
Which exact project that you're addressing? The one
this object memory der Medune Enkelab.
That's not mine, but
yeah, that's embarrassing. Yes. But still, okay, regarded as a general question to an architect.
Yeah, I mean, actually, that's. I mean, I can. Yeah. Yeah, sure. I mean, actually, I rather talk about others' work, not mine, because I don't want to interpret what I do as architect or as artist. So I more feel comfortable to talk about that project that you're mentioning. So to me, I can read it as an observer from outside, exactly representing and recapitulating the idea of ongoing and unfinished revolution, and placing it into a state and into a space of the city, which officially by the state considered as the emblematic space of a city which represents the goal and achievement of the Islamic Revolution. It's a space which actually, if you like, the Islamic Revolution was blossomed. Because it's right in front of the University of Tehran, right in front of the intellectual body. It is still a public space, which in the traditional sense of it, it was used politically and was enabled by the people, by the faithfuls, by the Revolutionary Guard, by the revolutionary subjects, and turned it into a kind of ideological space, ideological monument for the state to be celebrated. But even deep down, even the ideologists of the Iranian state, they know that the Islamic Revolution is not finalized, because the aim is to float on earth and to occupy the globe. The Islamic Revolution doesn't any Islamic revolution, not Iranian one, not the one happening in the 7th century, dealt with the territory. It floats over the territory. That's why they abandoned, even in the time of Muhammad, they abandoned the idea of nation or the relationship between the body and the territory in order to present or in order to create a body of a state or a body of empire that in 5 years can float from India to South Spain and can occupy that territory. Sadly, we see this phenomenon today with ISIS as well, because they are stateless and geographically, let's say, fluid, let's say, kind of forces that use this idea or mimic this idea in a way for the reason. So to me, that monument could be interpreted kind of paradoxically in both ways, from the point of view of citizens, which wants to resist, want to achieve their goals, want to fight for it, and for the government as well, which want to transcend the revolution and transport it to other places. Thank you.
Еще вопросы?
Hi, thank you for your talk. So my question is about changes. Today, big cities are changing, especially public space is changing forcefully by people who run it, by architects. You saw it probably in Moscow. You will see later that Moscow is also changing. More benches, more public spaces with parks and things to do. And Tehran is not... so the question is Tehran changing really? And is it going to change? Because Tehran is deeply rooted in Islamic culture, where public space is a domain of men, and where women should be hidden. This is the concept of walls, which you were talking about. So is Tehran going to change in the nearest future, or is it impossible? Because all these traditional things and Islam is stronger than these modern trends. Thank you.
Welcome. I agree with you in some senses, but perhaps what I wanted to tackle in this talk is that our conception of Iranian architecture or Islamic architecture as a space enclosed and public space related to gender and divided by gender is not the whole story. There is no public space. The concept of public space does not exist, because it's all about the interior, and interior is the only way, is the only place, is the only constructed piece of land that you can live in. So outside, which supposedly are public, we know it in the Greek cities, agoras, public spaces, squares, streets. In Iranian case, in a deserted landscape, in a harsh environment, is represented by death. If you're outside a space which is provided the water and shade, which means that you have 4 walls that protecting the water, bringing water from down underground to the surface and protecting it and giving it a platform to live, you're facing an unknown external forces. These external forces could be interpreted as enemies or environmental forces or any natural forces that you might know. So my idea, let's say, aim to go back and dig a bit the root of the architecture in this territory was to a bit question this binary division between the Islamic and non-Islamic. And let's say, even if you like, if we go back to the Zoroastrian culture, which was way before the Islamic culture, you find the same separation of spaces. The gender is not, let's say, specified spatially because of, let's say, ideological appropriation of space or ideological organization of space. It was the only way that they can live. The divided spaces was the only way that the span of architecture could be shaped. The room, the walls could be, was raising that high because it was the only way that the clay can handle, and the wall is the only place, is the only architectural artifact that can define a city from the lower scale of the cell, living cell, to the scale of a city as a whole, and a country, and an empire. And even a nice footnote would be, I don't know if you know or not, during the Achaemenid Empire, the Persian Empire was walled. There were 300 kilometers of walls, even around the territory, even around the landscape of Iran, because they wanted to keep it safe from the flood, from the enemy, or from any unexpected nature. So I'm a bit doubtful about that, let's say, interpretation, at least in this sense. But I would say if we want to stick to it as a hypothesis, I agree with you that it is changing. What we call today as, or what we know today as public space, streets, something outside the house, squares, public facilities, bars, cafes. We don't have bars with alcohol, of course. Parks are being populated equally with all genders, even more massively with women. The policing is being well moderated or well tolerated. So the interaction between people and citizens and their appearance in the streets or in the, let's say, common understanding of public spaces are much more visible today. So the idea of progression and change in that direction is happening already. At least in the last 10 years, it's kind of visible. But the policing, the ideological control, the state ideology, the state logic is already there, but is a kind of cat and mouse play. You'll be captured, you'll be released 1 hour later, you're always in danger or in fear of being captured by police or being caught by the police because of something that you don't conceive as illegal, but for their state official ideology it is illegal, but you don't know it because it's not announced. It's always free to negotiate or free to interpret. Therefore, there is actually rather interesting life happening in the streets of Tehran, I would call it. I enjoy it.
I would like to ask you about the recent cancelling of the Western sanction against Iran.
Yeah.
What is your idea about this? What do you think about it? How it's changed the life within the wall in Tehran?
Thank you. Nothing has changed. There are only hopes that are being more protected in the heart of people. So I would say nobody wants to be excluded, but even sanctions doesn't mean sanctions and exclusion from the world. It means alliance and friendship with the other part of the world, which are not using the mass media. So we are more friends with Russians, of course, and with Chinese and with South Americans. And that relationship is much more flourished and more, let's say, elaborated right now. So it's all about the foreign politics, which I would say has less to do with the ordinary and common life of the people in the streets. But if it has something to say, it is in the economical sense, the way that the transaction and the, let's say, low-scale businesses can go on in the city, can transcend the boundary of the country, or can establish an interaction between the outside world, whether Europe or America or East Asia. So that is changing next to hope for any change, because the change is part of the way of living, the way of resisting, the way of hoping or fighting for changing or for any some sort of resistance. Not in favor of, let's say, not for the sake of dominating or killing the other opposition or killing the other dominating power, but actually rather to find a dialectical existential relationship between the other part. I always like to use the idea of Carl Schmitt, the famous German jurist, which defines the idea of political not as a parliamentary politics at all, but rather a division or a relationship between the opposed forces. And the politics, or the idea of political is alive when the opposed forces are related to each other, they're associated. I mean, it could be a conflictual or transitional association, but I have to say this is happening or visible literally in the life of the city in Tehran. And the way that the people try to coexist with the power, and this power even could be interpreted as the environmental power, as the environmental harshness of the territory, which is not livable. It is in a dialectical matter. It is in a way of give and take. It is in a way of, let's say, finding a balance which is mobile, which is circulating and evoluting, if you like. Thank you. Thank you.